Okay, so today we're having a session on infrastructure and particularly with a focus on transport infrastructure. So I'm delighted that Graeme can join us this afternoon. So Graeme is the Director of Strategic Foresight at Jacobs, which I think is a very exciting role. He's described as being the futurologist within Jacobs, which makes me feel like an underachiever as a planning lawyer. It sounds very dull by comparison, but really Graeme's role is developing the business's understanding of and response to future changes in society, and then in turn thinking about future changes to the business of clients. And in that role, he's worked with Highways England, London Underground, Manchester Airport, as well as a number of projects with Transport Scotland, including the A9, which you'll all be familiar with, the work going on there just now, and currently on the second iteration of the Strategic Transport Projects Review. And for anyone who's not familiar with the StPR and what that does, that's the document that will inform transport investment in Scotland over the next 20 years across all modes of transport, ultimately providing the ministers with a programme of potential investments up to 2042. So there's a lot going on at the moment within infrastructure and particularly on the transport scene. So the work on the StPR is ongoing. Earlier this month, we had Scottish Government's programme for government, which was full to the brim of infrastructure commitments. And of course, we're expecting publication of the infrastructure investment plan, which will give a framework for the next 5 years later this month. In fact, we were just laughing before we came live that if it had come out this morning, we would have had to have had a quick read through before coming on live this afternoon. So there's a lot happening, or certainly poised to happen, and all really in the current context of COVID. So Graeme, just to really open up the discussion with you then, I've mentioned the programme for government, and that commits significant funds to infrastructure, which will lock in some of the positive changes in active travel that we've seen over recent times. But really bearing in mind the difficulties around behavioural change in transport, that's long been recognised as being a challenge. I think that's one of the challenges that's identified within NTS2. So how do we go about tackling those difficulties and trying to ensure that any gains that we've achieved over recent times can be sustained?
Well, yeah, afternoon all. Afternoon, Karen. Thank you for the kind introduction and for inviting me on today. So yes, let's get straight into that. So it's been a bit of a strange time, I guess, because we've probably since the first time since the Industrial Revolution, we've actually disrupted the way that people work. So, you know, we took people off the field, we put them in factories, and we've kind of had that model since that time. And this is the first point where, for obvious reasons, that's been disrupted. And it's probably it's been coincident with a point in time where digital infrastructure, such as what we're doing today, has actually been good enough for a large proportion of the population to be able to continue working. And there's some interesting behavioural science that goes into, you know, why do people change behaviour and what makes people change behaviour. And clearly all of the changes around COVID have been a forcing measure that's just happened. But within that, you've then got changes that people have decided to take upon themselves. So we share quite a lot internally with colleagues about what we're doing, and you find that people are out cycling at particular times in the day, or they're changing about the way that they do their work to fit in with family life, and particularly during the summer when lots of us were juggling various roles at that point in time. So yep. All of those things have changed. That gives an opportunity point, a kind of pivot point for transport, because you've kind of made that change in people's minds a lot about what's going to be different. And I think certainly we saw the announcement from, I think, Capita the other week about closing, I think, about a third of their offices permanently. Now, that fundamentally changes their kind of cost posture from a business perspective, and the genie's out the bottle on that now, and it's not going to go back in. So loads and loads of companies across the board are now looking at this and thinking about, well, are we going to have staff working from home more? Are we going to change the way in which we use our office space, and so on and so forth? So the programme for government piece is really sitting on the back of that, and also is reacting to and giving greater emphasis, I think, to the fact that during lockdown, and certainly through just this period just now, there's been a little bit of a, let's call it a land grab, because that's quite controversial. So what you've seen are when you've gone into cities and around city centres in particular, the need to give people more space has meant that actually we've redefined a lot of our public space through necessity. And it kind of reminds me of the experiment that was done in Times Square in New York, where instead of launching straight into a massive and probably highly controversial scheme to bring that square into a better public place, and place is a really important word, what they did overnight was move some plant pots about, and then let's see if the plant pot moving works. Yes, it did. Let's do a bit more. So, these things are all kind of gradual points of achieving change. I think the key thing is going to be how much of that can you hang on to when things go back to, in brackets, normal.
Yep.
And how much do you need to then have a little bit of carrot and stick going on to make those changes.
And bus decline was something that's been talked about, I suppose, a lot of late. Bus services were in decline pre-COVID. Scottish Government is looking at, amongst other things, talking about reprioritising use of road space. Do you think that that's the kind of measure that will be enough to reverse that decline within the bus sector? Or are there other initiatives that you would like to see brought forward, or that might be tried there? It's obviously quite a complex issue.
It's really complex, and there are always heroes and villains in the piece in bus discussions, and it's kind of it suits a certain narrative to say that it's all the fault of deregulation, or it's all the fault of X, or it's all the fault of Y. And the reality is that, you can go back in the statistics, and you can go back further, but if you go back to the early 60s, you had about 1.5 billion journeys around that in Scotland. You fast forward to the end of the 70s, that had halved, and you fast forward to today, and it's halved again. So it's not that bus decline is a new phenomenon. It's actually a really long-term slide that's been going on, and actually just a kind of decay curve almost. Hidden in those kind of overall statistics, I think, are some interesting differentials in Scotland. So if you go across to the east, Edinburgh has actually had a reasonably successful situation in recent times, whereas in the west, numbers have been declining quite significantly, and actually probably that's the biggest contributor to the overall Scottish number of decline. So infrastructure is kind of, I would say, the sort of first level of attack on this. There are particular points in the network which cause problems for bus services, and bus services, like anything in that sort of scenario of timetabling, regularity and predictability is everything.
Of course.
There's sometimes a bit too much focus on journey time, and actually people tend to, if you told somebody, I can knock a minute off your journey time, or I can make sure your journey time's pretty regular every time you do it, most people will choose the regularity piece. So that infrastructure piece is important, and it's an important building block, but it can't really be the only building block. And you have to look around. I think there's another topic probably under finance, which is around what does our fare structure look like, and how do we actually have fares that are are fair, other fair, in terms of the demographic that predominantly wants to use buses and needs to use buses because they have no access to other modes of transport. And at the same time, how do we influence the fact that actually it's really easy to drive to some places where buses go, and predominantly that might be city centres, but also other places. So the fact is that there's a kind of unequal playing field a bit at the moment. So there's an infrastructure, there's a fiscal, there's also a structural issue. And this is where the sort of discussion about franchising comes in, and whether a completely deregulated system is the right thing. And I think part of the problem in the UK in general, and Scotland's a microcosm of this discussion, is the discussion tends to be either end of the spectrum, is that either we should have a fully deregulated system or we should have a completely publicly owned, publicly run system. The reality is that there are lots of models out there that mix and match elements of those. So you can have sort of gross and net contracting, and there are umpteen models that can be chosen. And I think part of the discussion needs to be a bit more of a sophisticated and grown up look at what's out there, what have other people been using, what works. It's interesting, and it's a difficult comparison to make. But in the time that buses declined so much, you have a situation that rail use has only risen, and particularly in recent years. And that's a very different model from the model that the bus network obviously operates. So, there's for me, there are three things. There's infrastructure, there's finance, and there's the structural piece around how we actually organise the bus system. And I think that structural piece doesn't have to be the two extremes. I think there are some mixes and matches to be had that are appropriate, particularly for different areas of Scotland.
Well, and you mentioned the cities, what's happening in the cities, and you mentioned the West, which is certainly close to my heart, if anyone can tell from my accent. But Graeme, you're a member of the Glasgow Economic Recovery Group, which has been obviously working on recommendations for renewal of the city and surrounds post-pandemic, if we can look ahead. Now, there's obviously a lot to think about there, but what is the role of transport? What role can transport be playing as part of that sort of wider planning for future recovery?
Sure. So I think the Economic Recovery Group has a particularly short-term focus in the start, which was to help shape some of the immediate actions, and a lot of that was the stuff I was speaking about kind of validating and understanding the way in which the City Council predominantly was responding to the need for greater space for people, whether that be walking, cycling, or such like, and also working through and supporting on the necessary guidance and all the pieces around transport systems and how those would operate. More and more we've started to talk about medium and long-term effects, and I think principally that's around the fact that it's no rocket science to say that city centres are struggling at the moment, because we've taken a huge proportion of people who are economically active within those city centres and tend to be relatively high spenders, and we've just removed them and had them at home. So coffee shops, retail, nightlife, all these things have suffered. And one of the things that I think we're really considering is how and what do city centres look like going forward, and what do those transport hubs that we have in our city centres need to function as for the demands that are going to be placed on them. And that's all against that context of saying, are we going to have people predominantly coming into the city centres 5 days a week to work in offices in the future? And all of that has those spin-off points that, while the office population as a relative part of the overall working population is obviously just a chunk, it supports a lot of those other jobs that happen in city centre areas. So one of the things, in Glasgow particularly, the City Council has been talking about a longer term plan, which is around repopulating the city centre, because over time, and this is a particular thing in the UK, is our city centre populations have just declined, and we've had this move out of the city centre, and you kind of see that a lot. When we were able to go on holiday to places, you would see that. I go back and forth to the Netherlands a lot. I go to Madrid quite a bit, and the cities there have a very vibrant residential population that supports a lot of jobs. It supports a lot of activity. It gives that sense of place. There's that place word again, and so I think that, and moving that agenda forward, is going to be really important. In the East, we've been working. Jake has been working with the City of Edinburgh and other stakeholders on the city centre transformation plan, and that is going to continue, I think, to be the framework that sets out how we take the city centre forward. But there are big things that will still need to happen. In Edinburgh, there are further proposals on tram. In Glasgow, we've seen things around metro have obviously been trailed quite extensively. So I think the city centres still have to function as those hubs. I think one of the key discussion points is how do those hubs and city centres interplay with the second tier centres that for many years have kind of suffered, but actually are really busy now, because they're the places that people are now living and working.
Yes, and that I was interested to see in the programme for government picking up on this very concept that's getting a lot of traction these days around the 20-minute neighbourhoods. It's very sort of catchy phrase and idea that people are jumping onto that bandwagon. It's probably catching lots of ideas around sustainable planning that have been going on for a long time, but maybe badged in a slightly different way. But is that feeding into part of the discussions that you're having within that group and the ideas that you're looking at?
Yeah, I mean, it was actually part of a paper that I did for the group. Was talking around 20-minute neighbourhoods. I mean, it kind of I guess it kind of stemmed from Portland in the US, and they certainly put the name to it. I think it's something that lots of places have been doing, either subconsciously or not named as such. Places that have been really successful in having good place planning have been doing this for a long time. But Portland, in their forward planning, have kind of named this and pulled it out and said, no, this is something we're deliberately going to do now. And I think Portland's an interesting place for lots of reasons. And I think one of the things that they've kind of demonstrated, they've got a big focus, unusually for a big city in the US, on sustainable travel, active travel, and actually there's a lot of metrics around it about the economic benefit of that. So if you have people cycling a lot and walking a lot, you actually create a lot of economic activity in shop front activities, in cafes and bars, in in cycle repair. It seems a daft thing to say, but it does. But you also have, there are some slightly odd metrics out there around, number of bookshops per head of population, things like that, where you have a really big focus on the kind of local economy. So 20-minute neighbourhoods is, it's a lot about carbon, but it's also got some very sound economic pieces behind it about local economic growth and sustainable local economic growth.
Yeah.
And actually, 20 minutes, it kind of sounds, when you first hear it, you think, oh, how could I do all the things I need to do in a 20-minute neighbourhood? But 20 minutes is actually, you can walk about 2 kilometres thereabouts in 20 minutes. You can cycle about 6 kilometres. And if you kind of want that in real money, that's sort of Glasgow city centre to Gartnavel, or hang on, I better do an east example. Haymarket.
Come on, Neil, jump in.
Haymarket to Leith is about 6 kilometres, I think.
Yeah.
So it's actually quite a significant area. The key thing is how you make that area stick together, and how you make sure that people don't just get in their cars. We have. It's quite interesting when you look at the distance that people travel. We have kind of 10% of people work from home. This is pre-COVID, I should say. So 10% of people work from home. There's about another 10, 15% work within 2 kilometres of their home. There's another kind of 20%, it's higher in the cities, are in the sort of 2 kilometre to 5 kilometre band. Now, those are all absolutely in that 20-minute definition. And the difference that one could make to places and to carbon by actually targeting those sort of percentages are quite significant.
And I suppose there's a question, I'm wondering, Neil, whether do we have the right policies in place already, both sort of nationally and the typical sort of suite of policies that we see in LDPs that can make all of this a reality or work better, or is it poor implementation? The barriers really to it happening more successfully than it does currently in Scotland.
It's very difficult, because there's kind of there is a distance between policy and what happens, and that's because we've now pulled policy round to really facing into active travel as a country, but obviously what's going on over here is still kind of legacy world.
Yeah,
there's quite an interesting. I kind of use this analogy of it, which is the Netherlands, where actually everybody thinks the Dutch have been cycling forever. And my wife is Dutch, so I spend a lot of time over there, and I've kind of picked away at this issue, and much to her annoyance, I have to say. But it's true to say the Dutch have cycled a lot. It's not true to say that they've always had great cycling infrastructure. And actually, what happened in the 1970s was a culmination of two huge problems for the Netherlands. One was they had an appalling level of child injury accidents, so killed and seriously injured. And that was because post-war, the Dutch had got really affluent. They'd all bought cars, but actually kids all still cycled. And the trouble was they'd made, places like Utrecht, kind of, if you look back at photos in the 50s, they look like East Kilbride. No offence to anybody from East Kilbride. Yes, says the man who's sitting in Hamilton at the moment. But we had so they had that problem, and they also had the oil crisis. So that's interesting, because one of those is a public health crisis, and one of those is an environmental and economic crisis. Now that sounds pretty familiar. So what did they do? Actually, they did this as a national mission, and there's a kind of, I was going to say famous, it's famous in the Netherlands. There's a broadcast that the Prime Minister did at the time, and he basically said, we're not doing this anymore. Here's the plan. And when you go to the Netherlands, and when you cycle on what is some of the best cycling infrastructure in the world, bar none. Most of that's been delivered in my lifetime. And yes, I've got some grey hair going on, but you know, I'm not that old. So it's all doable. It just is all about, you know, that alignment of policy, program, action. That's the key thing that you have to go through.
Leadership, I suppose. Now, I wanted, and I can't, we can't come to the end of the podcast without picking up on, I suppose, climate change obviously being such a focus at the moment, and obviously the carbon agenda will very much be underpinning what we might expect to see coming out of a StPR2. I always struggle to say that. Clearly, one of the key themes carried through in the National Transport Strategy. So with that in mind, Graeme, do you think we can expect StPR2 to look very different from the first iteration, particularly thinking about the focus that there might be on new road infrastructure, and obviously last time round, well, certainly to my mind, very much dominated by the A9 and the amount of money that was perhaps sucked into that, maybe at the expense of other projects that could have been considered? Do you think it will be a different kettle of fish this time round?
So I'll say I'm not giving away any state secrets.
Sure.
But a few observations. I mean, I was heavily involved in StPR the first time round. And you're right to say, I guess, if you stand back from StPR the first time round, a lot of that was about sorting out our connections between cities. So we had things like the Edinburgh Glasgow Improvement Programme, A9, as you mentioned, Queensferry, you know, all of these kind of things that actually were quite big ticket infrastructure items. I think what sets StPR2 apart from its predecessor is that it first of all has been constructed very much on a regional basis. So those regions are quite heavily aligned to things like the city deal areas and the sort of strategic plan areas as has been. So I think that's, and it's kind of you can kind of skip over that almost when you're looking at it, but it's a really important piece because it allows the nuancing to happen for those regional areas to reflect what's important there, and that, I think, one of the issues that we faced in StPR the first time round was that we were trying to probably do something for Scotland, and in some cases that wasn't recognising the diversity of space, place, topography, and all these other things, you know, which Scotland has in abundance. I think StPR2 is more nuanced in that sense. I think the other big difference that I see is StPR2 is being, you know, it's far more embedded in wider policy. So, you know, you go back to StPR the first time round, yes, you will find references to equality, to health, to well-being, you know, all of these things, you'll find those, they won't be upfront. StPR2 is very much taking its lead out of the National Transport Strategy too, and these things are upfront and central in NTS2. You know, we are saying very deliberately in that as a country that we need a transport network that supports carbon reduction. We need a transport network that actually is about us being healthy and well. We need a transport network that's actually about social equality. Those are all really interesting things in a transport sense, because transports, I'll do the techie transport, but transport's a derived demand. So, you know, you don't go out and drive on the M8 at 8 o'clock in the morning because it's a nice place to have a drive. You do it because you're going to do something. And so those are really challenging things that come through in terms of, you know, how do you make something that's a derived demand like that address all these issues? And I think that's definitely going to colour the way in which StPR2 comes through. So a big plug, if you've not gone and looked at, for everybody listening, if you've not gone and looked at the case for change reports, go and look at the case for change reports. They're actually really interesting. This is me wearing my transport planning hat. But lots of interesting data there. So I like my data, lots of interesting stuff about parts of Scotland, and probably some things that that we all didn't know.
Yep, and I think the formal consultation has just recently closed with the feedback on those, but as Graeme says, all of that information is there, and it's really good stuff to have a look at. Perhaps just sticking maybe finally with I suppose on the climate change theme, government obviously putting a lot of stock in or reliance on the sort of move to ultra low emissions vehicles, and I suppose there may be some that think, well, is that just a means of allowing us to justify our want to keep up with the building of roads programme, that we point to that transition, and really is that a fair criticism? Do you think is the government perhaps over optimistic in that emphasis? Obviously we've got targets looming, and there are regulations and legislation that push things in a certain direction, but is that?
Yeah, I mean, the sort of electric vehicle piece is a really interesting sort of subtopic. I mean, I think it's fair to say when we look at transport infrastructure and road building in particular, even back in StPR the first time round, when you're doing the Treasury Green Book analysis, and this is not an advert for the Treasury Green Book, but when you're doing that analysis, you're looking at that sort of 60-year return period. We probably all understood that actually for some roads, the majority of their life in that period was going to be serviced by electric vehicles. So I don't necessarily equate an electric vehicle fleet with don't build any roads. What I do think is that there are some difficulties in messaging, because from a policy point of view, we want to focus on active travel, but we've also got this tranche of decarbonising the road fleet. And there's some lovely cartoons out there that you can look at with a big traffic jam of vehicles with everybody sort of saying, but I've got an electric car. And electric vehicles are not, are absolutely not the solution to congested networks. So it's all going to have to be a little bit smarter in how we do that. I think there are still some issues, I think, around electric vehicles, and I think manufacturers would like us all to believe that electric vehicles are absolutely carbon neutral, no problems, you're not killing polar bears anymore. The reality is it kind of depends where your battery's made, because if it's made in a big factory in China, then it's probably got an awful lot of embedded carbon in it because of the power grid in China. I think there's also issues about, lithium is not, lithium is a finite resource, and we don't really have that many good ways of recycling it yet. And cobalt, we use a lot of cobalt in electric vehicles, and half of the world's supply comes from the Democratic Republic of the Congo, which is not the most renowned for its environmental and human rights and other credentials. So yeah, there are, electric vehicles are not without their issues. And I think it's really important for government to be clear about, active travel is the priority from a carbon point of view. Yes, we need to decarbonise the fleet, but actually getting people walking and cycling is the real number one.
Has to remain the priority. Okay, all right. Well, thanks for that. And Neil, were you picking up on any of the questions coming in?
Yes, and thanks, Graeme. You covered a lot of ground within all of that, and inevitably it raises all sorts of issues at all sorts of levels. So I think the two main sort of streams come at it from very different levels, but maybe picking up to start with a question about, I suppose it's almost the transition phase we're in at the moment, and someone pointing out they're in the situation where once they get back to office working, with social distancing, it's only likely to be about half the people that are going to be in the office at any one time. And I think we're expecting most companies are going to be like that. And noting, as we all tend to do, how inconsistent it feels that you can go for a pint, but you can't get back to your own office. So it's maybe partly picking up on what you were saying about town and city centres, that for leisure purposes or eating and dining, we can go there, but we're not going there the same way we used to be into the office. And I suppose it's really just thinking, how do we see that working out in terms of longer term trends? Is there a danger that we focus too much on the short term, or is this actually the start of a longer term trend? And I suppose really actually I'm asking that, and I suppose the question I'm really asking is, how easy is it to predict at the moment where we're going to be in the next few years past that? Because it does feel as though a change has started.
Yeah, so welcome to my world. Yeah, I tend to think it kind of goes in two things. One is around the kind of cultural piece, and I think the other is around economics. So the kind of two extremes in some ways. So what we're seeing, with the Capita announcement, Capita not going to be the only company that starts to shed office space or rework its office space. I think we're predicting at Jacobs we're going to get about 25-30% of people in with physical distancing in the office when we're allowed to go in. So we are certainly thinking about how do we utilise our office space and what are we going to use it for? So instead of that, back to that industrial revolution thing, instead of just having lots of people stuck in a building doing stuff, are we going to change the way in which we use our office spaces? Are they going to become more about collaborative spaces? Are we going to be in the office maybe a couple of days a week instead of 5 days a week? And I do think there's a longer term trend here. I also think that the kind of genie's out the bottle of people being at home, and there's a kind of split here, and it's again, it's that piece about lots of people say, oh, everybody can work from home. It's pretty difficult to serve in Greggs if you're in your house, so not everybody can work from home. It's also the case that it's fine for me. Here I am sitting in Hamilton. I'm in my house that has a spare room, which is tidy behind me, as you can see, but it's not tidy over there. That's fine. I've got the space. I can be comfortable here. Lots of people can't. So there are all sorts of tensions that come in around that. One of our, at Jacobs, one of the priorities we've got when we get released is who do we need to get back in? Because actually, they're in shared accommodation or they're at mum and dad's and they're kind of balancing their laptop on the kitchen table and things like that. They're the priority. I'm not the priority. I'll be here for a while yet. But the trend is coming. Lots of businesses are looking at it. So it's all going to be about how do we reshape our city centres to make sure that they've got a solid future to them.
Yeah, and very interesting themes there. And I sympathise. I'm sitting with the tidy bit behind me too, and the untidy in front of me.
I think we've all got that. I think we've all got
that. The other thing I wanted to pick up was, I suppose it's the bigger picture issue, really, in the sense of you touched on some of the key challenges, and you flagged up active travel as being or has to be the priority, but also looking and thinking, well, how do we make that happen? And that's something within our planning sphere we talk a lot about, and saying, well, where is the leadership going to be? is there the appetite to make the difficult decisions? And again, I suppose it's coming back to your sphere of things. You're looking to the future. Where do you see that leadership coming from? Is it the professionals such as yourself? Is it the politicians, because ultimately they're the people making the decisions? Or is it the public? Is it saying, for instance, you mentioned about the sharing space that we've seen during lockdown, there being more of a demand from at least some sections of the public for, I think you described it as the land grab, getting some space back from the motor vehicles, whether it's for the cycle lanes or just the wider footpaths. So where do you see that leadership coming from in the next few years?
Yeah, I think each of those groups that you talk about, I think, has a role in leadership to play. I mean, clearly the political leadership is paramount for setting the context and direction. I think professionally, you know, we've got to reshape and reskill a bit. As a profession, we've probably become very good at doing big road schemes, very good at doing big rail schemes. I think we need to get very good at place and urban environments. And I think the public side of things, there is a bit of a sense of change of direction here, but you know, it's those issues of can I have an environmental mindset, but can I also divorce that from my love of, you know, taking my car out and being able to get places really quickly in that way? And I think we need some of those early kind of pilots. We need some of those stories that sort of show that there are those sort of wider benefits to places. You know, we know our road network's really problematic. This is a great opportunity to go in and sort some of that out and come out with a better product at the end of the day that's good for all of the people that want to use it.
Great, and I think that's a really good point to stop and just draw things to a close. A good positive message there. And thank you again, Graeme, for coming on and talking us through all these really important issues. And I think, again, as we've been touching on all the way through, things that we're much more conscious of, having gone through complete lockdown and now beginning to come out into whatever we're calling the current situation. So thank you very much. Thank you again to our audience and the people who put in questions. And just to remind you all, as you can see on your screen, we're doing these every 3 weeks. So the next one in 3 weeks' time, we're going to be talking about landscape, which very important issue in terms of planning decisions, particularly for anyone involved in onshore wind, but actually something that is much more inherent in a lot of planning decisions that possibly we all stopped to think. So please do look out for the invites which will come out, so you can get signed up for that and join us. And please do make contact with us in advance if there's anything in particular you would like us to ask. Don't feel that you got to wait for the Q&A function. So thank you again to Graeme, to Karen, and to all the audience. And hopefully there's still some sun where you are that you can go out and enjoy it. Thanks very much.
Thanks. Bye, everyone.
Bye now. Bye.